Hello and welcome to the CLB Forge podcast, where we talk about all things involved with mission, ministry, and making disciples. I'm Mike Natal.
And I'm Ryan Nilsson. Welcome to episode 2, Attack of the Clones. No, that's not the title of our episode today. But I just want to say I'm really proud that I made it all the way to episode 2 without a sci-fi reference. And
not even Star Trek either. I want you to realize this is going to be canonized, Ryan, that the first joke that you made was not a Star Trek joke. It was a Star Wars joke, thus proving that Star Wars is better than Star Trek. And now that's been canonized in our podcast.
No,
and you can't take it back.
I think this is the beginning of the end of our podcast because Star Trek is better than Star Wars. All right. Oh, and before our guest leaves, let's get on with our show. We've got a great show, no pressure, but this has to be really, really good. So we have a wonderful special guest with us today. He began serving at 59th Street Church in 2012. Before moving to Brooklyn to serve there, he served churches in Fullerton, California, and Queens, New York, and worked at Habitat for Humanity in New York City. He graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity degree in 2006. He's married to Rochelle. They have 3 kids, Lucas, Sophia, and Christopher, and they have a dog, Willow. Please welcome our guest, Pastor Andy Olsen. We're so glad to have you with us today. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Glad to be here. Thank you for the Star Wars reference. I affirm the superiority of Star Wars over Star Trek as well.
2 against 1. Canonize that, baby.
Me.
It's happening. Oh, that's so
this
great.
Is so wrong.
Oh, so good.
Before we actually get into what this is supposed to be about, I just want to say for our listeners and viewers that while we're recording this, we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So by the time we have this edited, it'll probably be about 2027 when we publish this episode. So just so you know, and the timeline, it's after the murder hornets during the coronavirus pandemic, but before the robot apocalypse.
Yes.
And before the aliens obliterated the moon.
Wow, solid.
I think that's what's coming.
Solid.
Basically, what you're trying to say, Ryan, is that at the time of us recording this was relevant. And so we're hoping that we can edit it all and put it out so that it's still relevant when you hear about it. But regardless, what we're excited about is that Andy's here with us, and he's going to talk about a little bit more about what things were like in Brooklyn, in New York, in that area when the virus first hit and how it's really affected his ministry. So I think regardless of the timeliness that we put this recording out, I think just having Andy's reflection on it and how he's doing ministry and how that has kind of changed and how his church has adapted through this, I think will be really beneficial for us as we think about, our 3 things: mission, ministry, and making disciples. All of that is involved in what's going on with the coronavirus, all of which Andy is currently doing at 59th Street. So we're really encouraged. So here's my first question for you, Andy, is when did the virus start to disrupt community life and ministry? And then to kind of go off of that also, is what was it like for you personally when the virus hit? And then how did it affect your family? And then how did it affect your church? So you can feel free to kind of talk blanketly about how, when the virus started, what did it disrupt?
Sure. Actually, I think for our church, 59th Street Church in Brooklyn, we actually have 2 language departments in our church. So we have an English-speaking department that I'm the pastor of, but we also have a Chinese-speaking department. And actually, our Chinese department sort of began to feel the effects of the coming coronavirus. Actually, even before I think a lot of people in the U.S., just because of connections with family in China and in Hong Kong. And so they back even in February, they were beginning to put certain protocols in place in their service. They were getting ready to celebrate their 40th anniversary, actually, as a Chinese department in the beginning of March, and decided to cancel that because of COVID. So we began to feel some of the disruptions even earlier, I think, than some places. In the beginning of March, where we began to see more cases. There were some of those early cases that happened even in New York City in the area. We have one healthcare worker who works at a hospital in Manhattan, and they had their first patient that came into the ICU with COVID. And so she actually asked me, like, even before that first Sunday in March, should we think about canceling services because of this? And so I was like, that seems a little bit extreme, sort of at the time. But said, like, let's just kind of see how things roll out. But so we began to feel some of we were having those discussions even early on. Even that first Sunday in March, we kind of put certain protocols in place, even for our English service, in terms of not having people greet each other, encouraging people to wash their hands, things like that. But then it was that second week, I think, when everything began to be canceled, all sports, and everything was kind of that we realized, like, wow, this is going to be very disruptive. And I mentioned this, on a webinar that we had, that for me personally, and our family, it was challenging because my wife is a PA, a physician assistant. She works at a hospital in Brooklyn. And so she was seeing this, like the preparations in her own hospital, and also the fact that at the time in March, she was pregnant and due at the end of April. And so we were kind of wrestling with, like, how is this going to affect her pregnancy if she continues to work in the hospital? And so we were wrestling through a lot of those things as a family, while also in terms of ministry. I actually got sick like the day before our last Sunday that we had our in-person service. We were planning to have that in-person service on whatever that second Sunday, I think, in March was. And I woke up Saturday morning and I was like, I can't lead our service because we just put in these protocols that, like, if you're not feeling well, you shouldn't be at the service. And so scrambling to, thankfully leaders from our church were able to fill in that. But it all of a sudden it kind of was brought home to me, the reality of the uncertainty of living with the midst of this virus, wondering, like, as we're learning more about the virus, even some of the symptoms that are there. So it was that was kind of the beginning of some of the disruption that happened for me, for our family. But yeah, obviously, like, after that, when all the orders came in terms of, like, stay-at-home orders, and New York State kind of had this pause that they put in. New York City schools being canceled. That was crazy. I mean, like, New York City, the largest school district, in the nation, and all New York City schools being closed indefinitely. We have two kids, one who's in first grade, the other one who's in pre-K. And so that, again, affected us, as it did so many other families around the nation, as schools were closed, but trying to figure out how to do working from home, as well as, remote learning for our kids, and doing ministry, caring for people in our congregation, in our community. As so many people, I think, felt, we definitely felt a lot of those things as well at the beginning.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. I think a lot of us, just to let it sink in, like, in New York City has seen more cases and deaths in, like, all but maybe 4 or 5 countries in the world. And it's just kind of hard to wrap your head around that. So as a follow-up to that, what were some of the biggest challenges that you've faced in doing ministry as a result of all this?
Yeah, I think there are a variety of challenges. One was sort of initially, as a pastor, just trying to figure out how to begin to shift ministry into online spaces. Our church, we have a website. I have, like, a sermon podcast, but we weren't doing any sort of video, before this, and so trying to, like, learn very quickly how to, and even thinking through different options for how to have services online. Even just we have a pretty large older contingent in our congregation too, but a lot of them are core members, and so trying to figure out how to help them, get online in different ways. Figuring out how to use Zoom, things like that. So there were those kind of challenges, just in terms of, like, figuring out how do we do church in this new situation. But also, I think, because as Ryan, you mentioned, the fact that New York City was hit so hard, we felt there were challenges related to that too, in terms of, many members in our congregation knowing people who contracted the virus. We had one couple in our church who they got the virus, and then her father passed away from it, and then two uncles died. And so just trying to how to minister to people dealing with fear, how to minister to people who are experiencing incredible loss, in their own lives directly from this virus. Healthcare workers, we have several workers in our church who work in hospitals, and they were just overwhelmed with the number of patients that came in. And so just trying to check in on them and seeing how we can support them, how we can pray for them. So those were some of the challenges I think that I felt in the midst of it.
Nice. Yeah. And that's tremendous too. The encouragement that I really see throughout all this, Andy, is that your church has really been adaptable, and they have really stretched themselves in order to be open to see how the Lord can use this opportunity to really further the kingdom in Brooklyn, in other parts of the city, and branching out. And so having these people in your church, in these different community options, really is a powerful tool for ministry that you can then encourage them to use what they're learning at church or what they're learning through devotionals or any of that in order to really encourage others who are going through a lot. I mean, I'm sure with everything that we've heard on the news, people are hurting in incredible ways as of recently, and to be able to share the gospel with them in a way that brings them assurance, in a way that brings them encouragement, really can be a powerful tool. And once again, to just kind of bring it back, Ryan, why we're calling ourselves the Forge is because we really want people to see these tools that are being used and see if they can use them themselves in a form of practical ministry that they find themselves in. So yeah, thank you, Andy, so much for sharing that. In light of what you've answered, I'd love to ask another kind of follow-up question, which is, how has this changed your community, and specifically, how has this changed your church too? And if you can talk, if you're able to talk about both sides of the church in terms of how the church has, two groups in there worshiping together. So feel free to answer either of those.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, kind of what you were saying just a bit ago, that I do feel like although there were a lot of challenges, there were also new opportunities for ministry that happened. And, one of those things was, we typically would have a Wednesday evening prayer meeting at our church building that was like maybe, 4 or 5 of us that would get together. But when we shifted our prayer meeting to Zoom, all of a sudden we had all these people joining us that were praying that normally wouldn't come to a prayer meeting in our church building. And so we began to reach people, and just it was a space, especially in those early weeks, where it was kind of a space where people could just come and just be very real and raw about how this was affecting them, being able to share stories, being able to pray for each other in the midst of that. And it was sort of just this midweek connection point for a lot of people, that I think bore a lot of fruit, and just a place where people could encourage each other. I think also on Sundays, even we saw we have a few families who were a part of our church, but have moved to Queens or other places and have had a hard time connecting with other churches. And some of them have been, consistently on our Sunday morning services, on connecting with our Sunday morning Zoom calls. And so that's been kind of cool, just to see ways of that some of the new avenues of ministry are actually helping to connect with certain people that maybe have felt more disconnected earlier. I mentioned this on that webinar too, that in our Chinese department, they began to do online services as well. And especially in the Chinese community, there are quite a few members in our Chinese department where one spouse is a believer and the other one is not. And so when all of a sudden the worship service was brought into people's homes, the non-believing spouse was kind of listening in the background on what was happening there. And so Pastor Novi, mentioned like that several members had said that this was a great opportunity for some of those spouses that would never walk into the church building and come to a service, but they're hearing the gospel, through that new avenue. And so I think there's been some really, positive transformational kind of changes that have happened through some of this. At the same time, again, some of those changes have been difficult. I think especially for our youth and children's ministry, it's been particularly challenging. Our youth and children's director, Brandon Tong, he's been hosting, things for youth throughout this period of time. But I think especially for a lot of the youth, it's just been hard for them to connect through online means, whether that's like just being exhausted from having to do that with school all day, and then sort of the Zoom fatigue of that, or just finding ways where it's harder for people to connect. But at the same time, I think he's had a lot of like individual connections with youth during this time too, just checking in on some of them. Like he was sharing a story just earlier this week about one kid in our youth group who has experienced a lot of racism as a result of, he's a Chinese kid and just, friends, people who were making racist kind of generalizations related to COVID, and so Brandon being able to like hear him out, listen to him, hear his pain, enter into that with him, and having a place where he could bring that rather than just feeling it himself and sort of just stewing in the midst of bitterness and pain that he's experiencing. I think also our community, it's been difficult, in a lot of businesses as around the country, being closed down for such a period of time. It's been a huge blow for a lot of people. And I think, in New York City, where things have still not, they're starting to open up now, but it's been much more delayed in the city. And so I don't think we've even felt the full effects of what that will mean in some of our communities. As you think about small businesses, even larger businesses that are reevaluating kind of what to do from here. So there's still a lot of changes, I think, that are still going to be even coming up down the road in the coming weeks.
When you think about what you've been through and all that's happened, I'm wondering what are some of the lessons that you've learned that we could benefit from? Advice that you have, things you've learned, things that are going to change the way you do ministry or the way you engage your community, the way you make disciples or lead your church. Have any lessons learned that you can share with us, or advice for us?
Sure. I think one big one has just been the importance of listening and taking time to really hear people's stories and their experiences. That's something that is just a part of ministry in general, but I think just feeling it even more so in this time, really, having to check in on members of my congregation individually and seeing how they're doing, and creating the space to just really listen, and the way that affects ministry. As you're hearing people, the pain that they're going through, the experiences they're having, the struggles. I think, in kind of related to that, also I think the importance of lament. I feel like there's a tradition, in Scripture, just of the reality of being able to bring our pain and our suffering to God in lament. And so a lot of those prayer meetings, especially early on, were very filled with lament, being able to express those emotions. And so I think that creating space for that, I think also, as I think about even some of what's been happening the last couple of weeks with a lot of the tension going on in our nation, especially around race, I think that's another area where we've seen that in New York City and Brooklyn as well. And again, the importance of listening to hear people's experiences and stories, and also being able to enter into that in lament, and not trying to fix it, not trying to sort of just try to immediately put a positive spin on things, but being able to sit with people in the midst of that has been important. I think another just thing that I've learned in the midst of this is the reality that people experience events like this in very different ways. And so I remember, like, early on, I preached a sermon on Jesus calming the storm, and talked about how we're all in the same boat, that we're all experiencing this But then I saw someone post like a meme or something like that, or a post on Facebook that said, we're all in the same storm, but actually we're kind of in different boats. Like we're different people are experiencing the same storm in different ways. And so I thought that was actually really insightful and that's
really cool.
That realizing that we're all being affected by it, but the way that it's affecting people are pretty different. Whether that's, again, depending on where you live, your socioeconomic status, your occupation, whether you're generationally, there's just a lot of ways that this has affected different people. And so that's shaped me. It's always been something that I think about when I'm preaching, realizing that as I'm preaching or sharing a Bible study, that there's many different people in the room that are coming from various different places, experiencing this differently. But I think that was even highlighted with more, just more vividness kind of during this period of time for me.
Wow. Sweet. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that too, especially the end of that. I mean, that's really impactful, I think, to realize, and for a level of empathy too, of kind of sharing with others, that while we're not going through the same thing, we are experiencing a similar thing, while it might take on a slightly different feel. But I think that is the power that ministry has. And I think that God can use those different experiences in order to allow us to minister differently to people. We talk about how we're the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. Well, if everybody was an ear, or if everybody was a hand, it wouldn't function as well. And so I think that really makes sense, Andy, that people are in different boats. And I think that God can use all of that in order to further his kingdom and to give people something to share his goodness in, which is tremendous. Mm-hmm. So yeah, thanks for sharing all that. And we're really happy that you were able to join with us for this episode, and you're actually our very first guest, and I think that you really set the bar super high now for everyone else who comes on this, so they should be encouraged but fearful at that too. So thank you for sharing your heart with us today, and we're going to continue to be praying for you and your ministry at 59th Street, and for your family as well, especially with the new addition that you guys just had. So congratulations for that. And I'll just kind of pass it off to Ryan, and he'll do an amazing outro for us as I put him on the spot.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yes. Let's end it on that note that Andy was such a good guest that it's all downhill from here.
Might as well just end the podcast right here. Right?
Thank you so
2
much.
episodes.
That was so great. That was so great. Hey, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks for being willing to hear. And it was an honor, a privilege to be able to be on with you guys and share. And thanks for your prayers and your encouragement as well.
Yeah. Oh, hey, thanks. Hey, thank you for enriching our lives. And
see you next time, because we're not really only going to have 2 episodes. Yes. We're going to keep going.
I'm looking forward to listening too.
I think
surprise, Ryan.
It'll be well over like 4 episodes, maybe even 5. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be an amazing run. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for helping us to make disciples, lead our ministries, and engage our communities, engage our mission field. Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you, Mike. And thank you all who are watching and listening. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.